You're listening to episode 25 of Literacy in Color. Today, we'll be talking about the importance of decodable texts with the faces behind Hooked on Comics, the authors and illustrator Brittany and Jackie. They're two IMSE, Orton Gillingham, and letters trained teachers who have a passion for the science of reading, and their hope is to get engaging decodable books into the hands of their students. They've been teaching for a combined total of 26 years and also happen to be best friends. Brittany has taught in grades kindergarten through 5th and is currently a 4th grade teacher, while Jackie has taught in grades kindergarten through 4th and is now a reading specialist. I'm excited for you to have a listen to this dynamic duo's take on decodable texts in the structured literacy classroom. Welcome to the Literacy in Color podcast. I'm your host, Michelle Sullivan, a science of reading advocate with over a decade of experience as a reading interventionist and literacy coach. I'm passionate about making evidence-based instruction both effective and engaging. If you're interested in captivating our learners on reading fluently and understanding language, or as I like to call it, keeping it colorful, then you've found the right place. Each week, we'll explore intriguing lit bits and practical strategies around the science of reading and structured literacy to help you be colorful and teach colorfully. Are you ready to bring literacy to life? Let's color outside the lines and make an impact together. Hello, everyone. Today we are joined by Brittany and Jackie from Hooked on Comics. They have become Instagram friends, and I was so excited to have them on as guests. So welcome to the show, ladies.
Thank you.
Can you tell me a little bit about your background in education and how you became immersed in the science of reading?
I'm Brittany McGuire, and this is my 16th year teaching. I have been in general education the whole time. I have taught grades from kindergarten through 4th grade, which is what I teach right now. And I would say that for a long time, I always felt comfortable teaching literacy. I don't know that I thought that it was a real passion of mine. It was just something that I was comfortable with. For a very long time, I taught literacy using Fountas and Pinnell, using the queuing system. And it wasn't until 2021, our school district started to make moves where we had to all become trained. In our district opted to go with IMSE Orton Gillingham. And so Jackie and I took the trainings together. And that was really, I think, the aha moment for me. And I will say for us, because we were sitting together during it. And where we started to realize that so much of what we had done for a very long time had not been founded in research, had not been in the best interest of kids. And I think sitting there and remembering students that I had worked with in the past and thinking back about what would it have been like if I had had this training back then, that was really what I think made me a believer. Mm-hmm. And we have since completed multiple trainings on it. And that's sort of how I think for me and for both of us, the passion behind literacy education and specifically focusing on the science of reading came to be.
And I'm Jackie Benson. I've been teaching for about 13 years. I started in special education. Then I moved into the regular ed setting. And for the past 3 years, I have been a reading specialist. When I went to college, and even when I got my reading specialist certification, the science of reading was nowhere to be found in my coursework, which I really think about a lot. We're doing a huge disservice to people who want to become teachers by not giving them this information, the way we know students learn best how to read, that's based in the science of reading. Of course, during our trainings, I had the big aha moment of, oh my gosh, everything I have done, is not what's best for kids. And when I was in college, my mentor went to the teachers college in New York, like Lucy Calkins Teachers College. And I remember everyone kept telling me how lucky I was was to be in her room. And she taught me everything she knew, which was all based in Lucy Calkins' units of study, all based in Ponce and Pinnell. And I took all of that with me into the classroom. That is what I used. And I stumbled upon the podcast, Sold a Story, right before we did our training with IMSE. And it was soul crushing, to say the least. Like, there's this one episode where she talks about like the lessons that she was observing and when the teacher is encouraging the students to cover up a word. And I did an audible, oh God, you know, like in my car, because like, it could have been me. You could have been recording me in my classroom, and hearing it verbatim and then hearing back like, oh, you were teaching kids to guess. And that hadn't been something I had realized. It was like a glass shattering moment, right? Of course, now you think back and you're like, how on earth did I not realize that at the time? And then, of course, when we got our training through our district, it was just reinforcing all the things that I had been hearing and trying to teach myself after listening to the podcast. And that was a big driving factor in becoming a reading specialist, as I've always felt like my strength in teaching was in literacy. And to find out that actually that strength was based not in science evidence, but in something that was kind of completely made up, that was really difficult for me to swallow. And I kind of vowed to never, ever do it again. And I'm so glad that now I can be a reading specialist and work directly with kids who have had a difficult time in the past and really give them instruction that is founded in the science of reading and see them succeed. It's amazing.
Yeah. And that's gut-wrenching, isn't it? When you think back and reflect on past times and you have this know better, do better moment. And I always like to have the perspective of we're going to do the best we can plugging a way forward. But I reflect back. I was a reading interventionist back in 2013. And I always like to say I had like 1 foot in structured literacy and 1 foot in balanced literacy, because for my neediest kids, I taught them Project Read Phonics. I did Wilson. I did all of the things, or in Gillingham based methods. And then for the just cuspy kids, we went the Fontes and Pinnell route. And you know, why? Why did we do that?
I know.
And now we know the science behind the way that brains learn how to read, and we shouldn't have wasted our time the other way in the first place. So kudos to you for your journey, and look at you now as an advocate for the science of reading moving forward. So your district's lucky to have you and all the teachers you get to influence and all the kids. Doing great things.
Yeah. Thank you.
Repent.
Yeah. All right. So today we're going to be talking about why decodable texts are important. Let's get into defining our terms. How would you specifically define a decodable text?
So something that makes a decodable text a really invaluable resource is that it is intentionally written to progressively incorporate words and letters that are consistent with what students have been taught. This means that if a student has only been taught a handful of letters, those words in that book are only going to contain the letters that students have been explicitly and systematically taught. Any word within the book that cannot be sounded out reliably based on its sounds is going to be something that has been specifically introduced to our students. We would call those red words. Those are words like of and the that don't have letters and sounds that correspond in the way that we would teach them to students. So the really important feature about a decodable text is that it matches your instruction completely. Only things that have been introduced are going to be within that text, and things that have not been introduced won't be.
Yeah. And isn't that the exact resource that we should be using for our students who are attaining those phonics skills? So how would you juxtapose that to different types of text that students might experience in other settings?
Well, I was going to say that, so one big difference is a lot of people who aren't clear about what a decodable text really is might be more familiar with predictive texts, which is certainly what I used for a long time as a kindergarten teacher, where students are able to figure out there's a pattern to the language and they use the picture cue to guess what it is, right? Dad is reading, dad is walking, dad is eating, things like that. And I think that it's important to know that while eventually we want students to be able to pick up and read anything, when they're first starting out, we really need to manage what we put in front of them so that they're building the types of habits we want them to have. And predictive texts in particular encourage guesswork because they're using words that often include phonics concepts you have not been taught at that age. And instead, you're looking at the picture and you're using your context clues and you're guessing what might be going on in the story. Jackie and I, when we were waiting earlier, we were sitting here and my kids' bookshelves are all around here. And she was looking at one of these books also that says, I can read at the top. And we were talking about books like that too, that you might come across.
Well, what's difficult about books like this is that it says I can read, and on the back it says, right, it has easy to read sentences. But after you flip through a page or two, it is not easy to read. This said like IGH words in it, words with the doubling rule. This is not a decodable text. This is not what we should be giving our early readers. There's nothing about this that's going to encourage them to read. It's going to encourage them to guess. And we know that that's not how students' brains learn, and that's not how kids learn how to be good readers.
And we know that it's really hard to undo. Once they become guessers, wow, it's so hard to get them to stop guessing. And because it's just such a natural thing to start just throwing words out rather than stop and do the work for it. So I think it's so important early on.
Decodable texts really help build that foundational knowledge and actually aid in supporting growth and development of our students versus just giving them opportunities to practice strategies that we know are not what's best for them. So I think that that's one of the most important things, that these are really used in an instructional purpose that matches your students exactly where they are and can really help reinforce those foundational reading skills that they'll build on the rest of their lives.
Absolutely. And oftentimes when we hear students reading a predictable text for the first time, we're like, wow, they're reading. It's like magic. It sounds so beautiful and fluent, and you're so impressed. The parents are happy because their kids picked up a book and they're just reading it over and over and over again. And it just gives this illusion of literacy. And that's not what we want, because eventually you go up the next level, the pattern goes away, and what are students left with? They're left with strategies that just won't work, and they're not going to be able to tackle an even more sophisticated text. So when it comes to structured literacy in particular versus a balanced literacy approach, why do you think using decodable texts is the key element to making that work?
So decodable texts are important in structured literacy because structured literacy is systematic and explicit, and decodable texts are designed to be systematic and explicit. We as teachers have that great assessment data that tells us the exact areas of needs of our students, the exact areas of strength, and we can match a decodable text to meet students where they are exactly as learners. So when we do our sound assessments with our students, we can see these are the sounds they have, these are the sounds they don't, and then give them a book that meets them exactly where they are, that they are reinforcing skills that they've already learned while adding in one new skill. They're progressive. So you're not bombarding kids with a bunch of new skills in 1 week. You're adding one new skill, right? That's manageable while they're still practicing everything else they've learned. And that's reinforcing all of that great phonics work that they have done previously. And so in a structured literacy environment, these are some of your best tools, especially in those younger grades, because these are books kids can actually read. We know students need to actually read and practice their reading to help grow as readers. And it also helps build motivation and confidence, which are two huge components in kids wanting to learn how to read and being willing to take risks, which we know is a really important thing in our students' learning, is that they're comfortable taking risks. We're asking them to do something new every day. Our brains aren't designed to learn how to read. That's really tricky when you're a young kid to be asked to do something that hard. So giving them decodable texts are some of the best tools that you can do to help aid them in their growth as readers.
Yeah, I love how you mentioned the confidence and motivation piece. It reminds me of that active view of reading. So that's a great model to reference. We could link in the show notes too. And when it comes to utilizing decodable texts, if a teacher maybe isn't used to utilizing those types of texts in their instruction, how and when maybe would they implement those?
Right away, right? I mean, if you are a kindergarten, first, second grade teacher, utilize these types of texts right away. They can be for any grade. I like to think of decodable texts also as like training wheels, where they help build up that muscle memory, they help build up that reading strength, and then eventually you will fade them out. But give them to students right away. Because as Brittany had mentioned, once they have a bad habit, it is very difficult to undo. So giving a decodable text as a first book that your kindergartner has ever seen is only going to set them up for success because they're actually reading.
Yeah, I always like to think of decodable text as if you're just sliding through the phonics. Like kids at the top of the slide, you want them to slide through those sentences as best as they can. And like in the beginning when you mentioned, there still may be some trickier words in there. There still might be some high frequency words, red words, whatever you want to call them, but you've explicitly introduced them. And when we're thinking about kindergarten, a decodable text in kindergarten might look different than a decodable text in second grade. And sometimes early kindergarten, not even early, I would say maybe a couple months into the school year, it might only be a sentence or two. And that's okay because we want to meet them where they are, how you mentioned that in the beginning.
I can tell you that writing a decodable text for kindergarten is wildly different from writing one for end of second grade.
Yeah. But I like miss those as an editor because like they've got like 50 words. And I was like, oh man, this is the dream. And then our level 2 had like 600 the last book. And I was like, oh man, I really wish it just said Bob is a dog.
Yeah.
That is so funny. You would think opposite, right? No, it's so much more challenging when you're so more limited with the phonics features.
I remember very clearly the week we got N to be allowed in a word. And I was so excited because I had all these words ready to go. And I was like, this is my week. I'm writing a comic that uses the letter N.
And the letter E. When we finally got another vowel.
E was a big one.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That was a good one.
I feel like Wheel of Fortune. Can I have a vowel?
I know.
It kind of is like that.
I know.
So fun. So for teachers who are new to this work, you guys are the experts in writing decodable text. So how can teachers maybe identify higher quality decodable texts? Because there's so many on the market now. There's so many just online that people can access for free or paid resources. Are there any red flags maybe you think that teachers need to watch out for?
There are 2 great sites that teachers can go to, the Reading League and UFly, and each of those institutions have decodable book lists that they have vetted and recommend. Those are a great place to start. Science of reading, decodable books, those are big buzzwords now. And you're right, somebody can just put that on a resource and it isn't truly decodable. So the second piece of advice I'd have is if you are looking at a resource, really look at it, look at each page, and then decide, can I actually sound out a majority of these words? I know when we're doing the books, we make sure that each page is at least 50% full of just words that can be sounded out. So
not red words.
And they're not red words. So if you're looking at a page and it's a majority of red words, non-decodable words, that is not a decodable book. Also see, can you find some that align to a scope and sequence? That's going to let you know that it is systematic and explicit and the text can build on one another. But I think the Reading League and UFly, they've got some really great resources. UFly has some free decodable passages that people can download. I know I use them in my small group work.
Same.
Yeah, Brittany does in the classroom as well. So if you don't want to have to spend a lot of money while you're trying to search for these good resources, that's a good place to start and hopefully get you familiar with what a format of a decodable text is. That would be my best advice.
That's really helpful. And I think it's important to keep in mind too, like decodability is dependent on the text and it's also dependent on the reader. And like you said, what they've been exposed to on a phonics scope and sequence. And when Art District was first vetting decodable resources, one aspect we wanted to look at were which companies are most closely aligned to our scope and sequence. Because if a company has a completely different scope, these aren't really going to be decodable for us.
Yeah.
They're lovely, but it's not really going to work with our phonics progression. So that's important to keep in mind too.
Yeah,
it's true. And there are some that are, I think, more easily interchangeable than others, right? Like, even though we teach the IMSC scope and sequence, like Jackie said, I use a lot of UFly passages and I find that those work pretty well. But again, I'm also using them with slightly older readers who were not exposed to this in their primary grades like they should have been. I think like if I was teaching kindergarten or something like that, I would probably be even more selective about what I would use to make sure it was truly aligned to the scope and sequence that I was teaching.
Yeah, that's really, really important considerations. So your comics are so fun and it's such a unique take on decodable texts. Can you share the story of how they came to be?
Sure. So we mentioned a couple years ago, right? We were doing our own training as teachers and learning more about the science of reading and how we were going to bring it into our classrooms. And at the same time, my oldest son, Kip, who is now an 8-year-old third grader, he was in first grade and he was coming out of kindergarten where he had been taught with the cueing system. And kind of like you mentioned before, he was that kid with the predictive text in front of him. Oh, beautifully reading every word that was on the page. According to his data at the end of kindergarten, he was an on-grade level reader. But when I was doing this training, I was starting to sort of see Kip in all of the things they were talking about, right? He was a kid he's got an excellent memory, an amazing vocabulary. He's a brilliant little kid. He was great at figuring out words from context and from picture cues. He was excellent at memorizing his sight words, but his spelling was poor. And when he was given an unfamiliar word, especially out of context, he had absolutely no strategies for how to break that word apart and figure out what it said. And the more we were learning about the importance of segmenting phonemes and blending and things like that, I realized this kid cannot read, right? He's going into first grade. And in first grade, he was not making progress. It was around January that we were meeting with his teacher because we were concerned at what seemed like basically no progress that he had been making. And now, luckily, at this same time, his school was adopting Orton Gillingham IMSC as their instruction. His teacher began teaching it. He was receiving it in intervention. And so he started to make progress that way. We didn't know then, we were still a little ways out from learning that, like 1 in 5 people, Kip has dyslexia. And the only way he was going to learn how to read was through systematic, explicit instruction. So he was getting that instruction at school, but at home, I knew how important it was to get him to practice and to read. And to put it mildly, Kip hated the Decodable books that were coming home. He would refuse to read them. He thought because, he is a smart kid, he kind of picked up that there wasn't really any real storyline to them and was sort of like, this is a bunch of nonsense. I'm not reading these books. And there was one day in particular, I remember it very clearly, where he and I were getting into it and I was trying to get him to do his reading practice and he would not. And he stormed off to his room. And I found him a little while later, surrounded by comic books, happily perusing them. And he spent like 90 minutes doing it. And I texted Jackie and I said, why are there not decodable graphic novels or decodable comics that are out there? Like, we know kids love this format. Why are the decodables that are out there so bad? I need this kid to read. All I can put in front of him is decodables, and he hates everything that goes in front of him. And that was really how it was born. We sort of turned to each other and said, we have the training and the know-how and the creativity. Maybe we should do it and we could start our own. And that is where Hooked on Comics came from. And we really started right after that.
Yeah.
We got going with our first set of comics.
Yeah. We were both really excited about the idea. I think in life, sometimes people give you a lot of ideas and they might say, hey, you want to do this? You want to do that? And you're like, oh, that sounds like a great idea. And when Brittany first came to me with this idea, it was like, yes, this is like what we are meant to do. We need to do this right now.
She kept saying to me, I'm not going to let this go.
Yeah,
we have to actually do it. And I mean, honestly, in full transparency, I think if my own child had not been the motivating factor, I probably wouldn't have, because you know how it is. We're busy working moms who have so much going on. Taking on something like this was a lot. But basically from the very first one that we made, reading it with him, but then also just reading it with other kids, It was like, no, we have to keep doing this.
It's so motivating to see when you're working with students, to see them feel successful and just really feel like, oh, wow, these are something that you enjoy. We have to keep going.
Oh my gosh. I have like the hairs on my arm are standing up.
I mean, like Brittany said, it takes a lot to convince somebody with like young toddlers at home that like you should add something onto your plate.
Work more.
Like, when something aligns so perfectly with like your values, you have to do it.
And so we started out saying, okay, we worked on the first 7 in December of last year, actually. By the time Christmas break was over, that was when we released them. And my younger son, who was in kindergarten, who was getting IMSC Orton Gillingham right out the get-go, was like, when are you going to make some for kindergarten? So then we started doing multiples a week and went from there. And 68 comics later, here we are.
That is so special. I love that story. I didn't realize. And there's nothing quite motivating like a mom and a mission.
It's true. It's so true. And there is a lot of my kids in these books just because I'm so inspired by their goofiness and their antics and things like that. And that Kip and Gus both, who are my sons, they are both characters throughout the comics who appear, and other kids that we know as well. I have Jackie's son is in them. We've got lots of little Easter eggs of our real life, which makes it even more fun.
Okay, and stop. Your kids' names are decodable CBC words.
I know. Well, and that's the funniest part, Michelle, is when she texted me the idea. She was like, I think we should make decodable comics, and Kip and Gus's names are decodable so they can be characters. That's exactly what she said.
And then I said, but we have to find an illustrator. And unfortunately, we did not. So it turned out I became the illustrator as well, which was not part of the original plan.
No. And my son's name is Wyatt. And so we both were like, well, we have got to wait until Schwa. Wyatt can't be in here for a long time.
Yep. But you know what? Once we had Schwa, Wyatt appeared.
Yes. But yeah, having your children's names be decodable, it was meant to be. It was meant to be for Brittany to write these books.
Well, I already know the answer to this, but what makes your decodable text a little bit different than what's already on the market?
So I would say, obviously, we know that they're in a comic format, which is different from other decodables you've seen. So there are speech bubbles, there are call outs, things like that. I would say they're also different because they are 100% aligned to the IMSE scope and sequence. So if you are teaching that scope and sequence, they align perfectly. But I will say that we have a lot of people using them who are using other scopes and sequences, and it works really well with a lot of different ones. Another thing that's different about ours is that we write them in a series format. So every 6 or 7 books are a series. And because of that, it means there are recurring characters, there are cliffhanger endings, things like that. And they sort of all tie in together, which really gives kids, I think, a chance to feel more invested in the story. They get to know the characters. They get excited when one of the characters returns from maybe a previous series or something like that, which motivates them to be reading, right? I think the number one thing we hear, both from our students and from teachers who are using our comics, is that when they finish one, the kids say, when can we read the next one, right? Can I read the next one right now? And that is not by accident, right? We're trying to make it that way so that kids will want to keep practicing and keep reading.
I remember hearing someone speak years ago talking about who you are as a reader and what was your favorite book as a child. And first thing that came to mind, I'm like, Babysitter's Club. I love the Babysitter's Club. I read through the whole series, And the point they were trying to make is that being a series reader makes you the lifelong reader. And when you get yourself into a series, you really get hooked on, like you said, being invested with characters and falling in love with the characters and the plot and everything at hand there. So I think that's really special because there's very few decodable series out there, and you're offering a whole new venue for kids to fall in love and be invested with characters while maintaining true to the phonics features, which in turn is building up their reading capacity, which is really, really cool.
And not only when Brittany is writing them, not only are they interconnected, but she's really careful with her illustrations as well, where she hides a lot of things in illustrations intentionally that kids come to realize. There's a page in one of the best books that there's a big bookshelf on it. They're at a toy shop that is just full of items that have been introduced in the kindergarten books, the books prior. And every single time students get to that page, they just go crazy naming all the things. Are like, oh my gosh, that's Nell, that's the doll. Oh my gosh, that's Chip's choo-choo train. Oh my gosh, those are Gus's sunglasses. Yeah. So when she's doing the illustrations, not only are the stories excellent, but the illustrations are very thoughtful and really engage the kids. It's so cool.
Thank you. My kids like when there's the wanted poster for the crazy puppy up on a subway later in a book. That's their favorite one.
Yeah, she hides a lot. There's one character, Chip, in one of the books. He's essentially playing hide and seek. And throughout some of the books, you'll see Chip randomly in the background of pictures hiding. And then the kids will be like, oh my gosh, there's Chip.
It's nice because, I have it built in with my kids being the ages they are. So I just sort of ask myself, what will my kids want in this, right? What is going to make them be like, oh, look at that. Or, oh, I can't believe it was, or I knew it was going to be this. Mm-hmm. And so I work off of that.
Yeah, you must have worked for Disney in a past life because you've got Easter eggs with your kids' names. You got Easter eggs in the pictures. I love it.
We're coming for you, Taylor.
Yeah. So how do you stay true to balancing the phonics principles while keeping up the engagement in terms of storyline and illustrations?
I think that's a part of where our partnership comes in so well, because the whole point of writing it really is the phonics principle. And so when I'm starting with one, the first thing I start with is what is the concept, and having lists of words that follow that concept that need to be used in the story and building it from there. So by keeping the phonics sort of forward in my mind as we're working on it, that makes sure that it is that way. Jackie is so good at carefully combing through and catching anytime I might use a word or a term that it has not yet been explicitly taught, and making sure that we fix it and come up with an alternative to it. So I feel like that's sort of how we focus on staying true to the phonics principles, but then the making engaging, it really is about thinking sort of, what do kids like? What kind of, there's goofy humor in them and action and the sort of things that are going to make a kid laugh. I think you can't be afraid to have stories that are really silly. Our story, they're very silly. There are times where I've had words in front of me and I haven't used them yet. And I'm sort of like, where am I going to fit this in? And I'll just start saying, you know what? I'll have one of the, like one that comes to mind is in the book that's about AR, R controlled vowels and AR saying R. I had a bunch of words on it. And so I went back and I just made one of the robots start shouting out suggestions at evil Dr. Gus of things that they could put out. So should we release the garlic sharks, sir? Like, I don't know. What's a garlic shark? It doesn't matter. It's an AR word, but it works. And it's just silly, kind of goofy stuff. So I think we try to combine those two things as we're working on the comics.
It's so funny. And I think too, when you think about graphic novels and the kids who like Captain Underpants and Dogman and all those fun things, and teachers who maybe shy away from kids even wanting to read those kinds of books in upper elementary and beyond, they actually lead to a lot of interesting comprehension work, because comic books are not easy reads, and you think they're easy, and there might be more illustrations and less words on the page, but you have to do a lot more thinking work when it comes to it. So
for sure,
I think the same goes for the Decodables as well, like reading the speech bubbles and the thought bubbles and leading to more like inferential work out there too.
There's definitely a lot of inferential work that's with it. I agree with you that oftentimes when you look at a comic, people do think that. And that was sort of part of why we knew we had to create these, because they are not easy to read. Regular comics are very difficult to read. And so when you have a kid who's drawn to that format, and so many kids are, it's hard to bring that to fruition for kids who are still learning to read or are struggling to read, and being able to make those things together. And I think too, oftentimes some do have lower word count, but I think it's the breakup of the words on the page that tends to give more of that impression. Like our later comics, like Jackie mentioned earlier, I think in our late level 2 comics, they're 8 pages long, but they have 500 to 600 words over the course of them. Whereas other comparable ones on the same topic might have 200 or 300 words in them that are written in a standard format. So we are able to fit in a lot, I think, because you can kind of put it all over the place.
That's huge. What a difference.
And I think some really powerful feedback we've also received from parents who have used them, teachers that have used them, is that they feel like it kind of gives dignity back to their lower readers, where we know that students who are behind often know it, especially when they get into those upper grades, and they don't want to be reading books that look different than what their peers are reading. That is not going to motivate them to practice if they're feeling self-conscious. So these books, the formatting across the series K1 and 2 is the same. The cover art looks the same. You are never going to know if you are reading a level 1 book versus a level 2 book. And that is what really helps kids feel comfortable and more motivated to read, because they are reading texts that their classmates are reading. It might be a different text, but that's normal. Kids read different books. But this kind of gives them their dignity back in some ways, not feeling like they're the struggling reader, feeling like they are the reader who is reading everything that their peers are reading.
Yeah, if you're a 5th grader reading at a kindergarten level, you don't want to be seen holding a kindergarten book in front of you. And so we've had a couple of special ed teachers and parents and things like that who have told us, especially for older upper elementary struggling readers that it has been a game changer for them.
Mhm.
So
That is huge. And I'm even thinking back to like balanced literacy days, the fourth grader who couldn't read and, oh, they have to read this level A book. Like, oh, geez, what a heart wrenching thing. The kid is never going to want to read if you put that text in front of them. But wow, like putting something truly decodable in front of them that looks just like the things their friends are reading is really not only special, but important. So kudos to you guys.
thank you.
Thanks.
It's obvious that you are all about the fun. And I know that you have a lot of fun tricks up your sleeves for using decodables in various ways. So, what are some ways that you're using decodables in maybe the classroom setting or the intervention setting each week with your students?
So in intervention, we do a decodable book every week. And one of the first things we do is after I explicitly introduce a concept, I hand the students one of the comics. And something about ours that is unique is that since they are printable, you can write directly in them. And so one of the first things we do is highlight all of the words that align with the concept that we have learned. And then we will go in with our red crayons. I do this especially with my kindergartners and first graders, not as much with the second graders. They don't need it. But with my young readers, we go in and we underline all of the red words in red crayon. So in their books, they have a visual cue of the words that they can decode and the words that they know that are red words, words that they cannot trust all of the sounds. So those might be words that they know that I can help them with if they don't remember it. And they're not going to waste that important reading stamina trying to sound those out. So that, at least for me, has been a really powerful way of using the decodables, is just giving students essentially a roadmap as they're reading. This is a word you can decode. This is a word you can't. At the end of the week, they love coloring in the pictures. And at any point, if I want to see, are they really mastering these concepts? I can just give them just a blank new one that I've printed that doesn't have all the writing in it. But they have found a lot of good ownership in those books, right? We have kids that take them home each week and they want to like keep the series together. And they've decided that this character always wears a red shirt. So then they make sure that in every book, they color them in a red shirt. You can do a lot with decodables, right? After you've highlighted the words, you can make a word cloud with it. You could say, hey, choose 3 words that you have highlighted in your book. I want you to write 3 sentences with those words. Brittany's also created some comic strips with some of the phonics concepts that students, you can encourage them to make their own, or they could also try to read the speech bubbles and do their own pictures.
I do all the same things, but I would say also in my classroom, when I'm using other decodables that are out there, for example, especially because there's some good one-page ones you can get, like we mentioned, UFly. IMSE also has them. There's a lot of places where you can get those. And those can be fun and interesting to read. But one of the things I do that I can sometimes make it more fun is I'll just take a couple of highlighters and I'll turn it into a reader's theater really fast. I'll highlight anything that's going to be the narrator in one color, and at the top I put a mark of it, and here are the couple of characters, and I do that and I'll give it to the kids and I'll have them read it that way instead. I am excited that IMSE has released readers theaters now, so you can use those as well, but you have to pay for those. All it takes is a highlighter and a minute to be able to kind of do it like that. I also sometimes will chop up decodable one-pagers, and I've done all kinds of things with them. I have hidden the pieces in Easter eggs and we find them and put the story back together. I have done things like where we are illustrating a certain part of it or things like that. It's nice when if you have a real decodable book that are real books, those are great. But it's nice when you have something that's printable, because then you can kind of mess with it a little bit and turn it into a game, turn it into extra practice, color in it, write in it, things like that.
And I will say the first grade teacher in the building where I work, the way she uses decodables is she gives students a previous week's decodable as that week's work. So after they have had a concept and worked with it for a week, the next week they use that decodable as they're learning a new concept. So that's another way that you can use them as well.
Those are all such great ideas. I also love printable decodables because I think they just lend to, like you said, so many more activities and games that can be done with them, cutting them up, mix up sentences, like all the things. And like you said, even cutting up chunks, and that leads to comprehension work again. Let's put this in an order that makes sense. Yeah, just any way that gets them rereading in meaningful ways where it doesn't just feel like a daunting rereading task.
Absolutely.
And some feedback we've gotten from parents is we often have parents that say, what can I do to help my student read at home? And we can say, here, this is the book. You can keep it. right? We can print more copies at school. This is the exact thing that your student is learning this week. They get to take it. They get to keep it at home. You don't have to worry about returning a book to the library or it getting damaged. These are books that we can provide to families that kids can keep at home, that they can use to practice over and over again.
Yeah, that is so, so, so special. Parents are always looking for resources, so that is an invaluable tool. Do you have any specific strategies or routines that you have found incredibly effective for decodable texts with whole class instruction?
I mean, when I've done it whole class, honestly, I do it pretty similarly to small groups as far as prepping students to, like Jackie said, maybe go through and highlight the concepts and things like that. The other routine that I would say that I do teach, especially because I'm teaching fourth graders, but I have fourth graders who did not receive this instruction in the K2 setting. And so I'm sort of teaching two different things at once with them. And when we're doing our more phonics-based work, which a lot of them are, one of the routines I'll teach them too is that when you come to an unfamiliar word, we do our syllable division practice right there on the page, right? So even though this isn't a syllable division practice page, if I come to a word I don't know, get going, mark those vowels with a V, start drawing your vowel bridge and figure out what syllable types you have to help you figure out the word. I also teach students both when they have a decodable book, because sometimes the text can be too small for that, but any book that they read. What I have my fourth graders do now is we read with a little blank notebook next to you so that if at any time you come to an unfamiliar word, you write that word out and you do your syllable division there on the notebook to try to figure out what the word says. And that has helped a lot. But otherwise, I do a lot of the same stuff, whole group. I think in my case, I would say I only use Decodables whole group in the very beginning of the year before I've had a chance to fully assess where we are and what everybody needs. And because I'm teaching an upper grade, but I'm looking at students who did not receive this previously, I have students who come to me and they don't know what an open and closed syllable is. No one has ever taught them that. And so some of those kind of fundamental things, I sort of feel like I have to teach whole group as a review to make sure we're all using the same language and we know what we're doing as we kind of get our work going. And other than that, I tend to typically keep it into small group work for my decodable books. I think if I taught younger grades, I would use them whole group probably more, like I know my son's first grade teacher teaches them whole group each week.
Yeah.
Yeah, because K1, 2, those are your pivotal decoding foundational skill work years. And we expect them to be able to transfer that into any book.
Yeah. I mean,
that.
And our books, I will say, because, they come as, and a lot of them actually, well, any of the ones that are printable out there, you get them as a PDF. So you can easily display them on, say, a smartboard or things like that and be able to use them whole group in that setting and not just be using the tiny paper copies in front of kids.
So helpful. I love it. We're coming to a close here, but before we sign off, what's one piece of advice that you want to give teachers who are maybe unsure on how to effectively utilize decodables in their instruction?
The first piece of advice I would love to give is if you haven't had the opportunity to get some training in the science of reading, I would highly encourage you to do so. The Orton Gillingham training, the IMSE training that we did has really changed everything about the way that we teach reading. So if you can, I can't recommend getting that training enough. The other piece of advice I'd give just about decodables is to just give them a shot. I think sometimes as teachers, we have preconceived notions about what our kids can and can't do. I remember when I was receiving the training, they were showing kindergartners starting to read almost right away. And I thought, that's impossible, right? They need to know more before they learn how to read. That was a preconceived notion that I had that was wrong. And I think we sometimes hold our students back in that way. So give them the opportunity, let them surprise you. Because I guarantee if you give them a decodable text, you are going to see them as true readers for the first time if they've only been using the predictive text prior to that. So just please give them to your students, get them in your kid's hand, and then see how they can use and utilize them. And I guarantee you will continue to use them in your instruction.
I agree. I guarantee it.
It's a Benson guarantee.
I think that, I don't know that I have any advice that's particularly inspiring, but I would say sometimes when you're starting out with something like this, it can feel really overwhelming and it can feel like there's so many things to incorporate, right? Oh, they're telling me I have to do this and I have to do this. And now you're saying I have to use decodable books. And so one of the things that has helped me is to sort of just build like a weekly routine of how you're going to do these things, because in my mind, at least, it makes it more manageable to plan for. So, for example, in my classroom this year, right, in my small groups, Monday, we're introducing our new concept. On Tuesday, we're covering red words. On Wednesday, we're doing our syllable division. On Thursday, we do dictation. And on Friday, we do our decodable. And even though I have multiple groups at all different levels that I'm working with things on, just by sort of setting that routine for myself, it makes it so much easier for me to plan week after week what I'm doing. And I also think it's easier to start trying some of that new stuff when you are like, okay, I'm going to work with the Decodables, but it's just this one day a week that I'm going to do it to start, or however you do it. But I think building a weekly routine can be a really nice way to make it more manageable for you to start trying to incorporate these things into your instruction.
That's so great. I love a good routine. And I feel like when you have a good routine in place and the students know what to expect, it also makes instruction a lot more seamless because they come to the small group table and they know this is our game plan for the day too. And I love what you said too about just giving it a shot, because oftentimes critics of Decodables will say Decodables rob the joy of reading. And if you'd only give a kid a level text, they would love literacy. And it just goes to show that Decodables have come a long way in recent years. And your work is a true testament to that, of how engaging and how beautiful and how fun they can be for students, and no joy robbed in the making of these books.
Oh, thank you. We try to keep them joyful first. That's the goal there.
Love it. That should be your tagline. So this has been so wonderful. You had so much great information to share with my listeners, and I'm sure they would love to connect with you. So where can they find you?
So you can find us on Instagram at Hooked on Comics. We are also on TikTok with the same name, Hooked on Comics. We have a website, hookedoncomics.org. That's where you can submit questions to us, or maybe you have a school district that can't buy through Teachers Pay Teachers. We can work with you directly to buy our books. We do have an exciting new product that I'm going to let Brittany talk about a little bit that's coming in January.
So we currently have 68 comics out, which are aligned to the comprehensive level of IMSE. So covering everything from single letter sounds all the way through 3 great rules and homophones and things like that are all completed series. They've all been vetted and approved by the Reading League. They are ready to go on our site. And in January, we're excited because now we are starting our newest series, our Morphology mysteries. And those comics, which are aimed at slightly older kids to learn morphology, including affixes, Latin, and Greek roots, will be coming out in January.
And I also realized we're on Teachers Pay Teachers. That's also where we sell them.
You mentioned it as an aside. Yes.
Love it. We could link all of that in the show notes. And Lord knows I love Morphology, so I am going to be jumping when those get released.
I'll send them your way.
Oh, yeah.
So exciting. So thank you so much for coming on the show. This has been so wonderful, and can't wait to connect again.
Thank you so much for having us.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for tuning into Literacy in Color. I hope today's episode left you feeling both inspired and equipped with something new to add to your teaching toolkit. If you're enjoying this podcast, it would truly mean so much to me if you'd leave a 5-star review. It helps other educators find the show and join our colorful community. And don't forget to hit the follow or subscribe button so you never miss an episode. For more tips, tools, and resources, be sure to check out the links in the show notes at michelleandthecolorfulclassroom.com. Thanks again for listening, and I'll catch you next week. Until then, be colorful and teach colorfully.